everyone. My name is Alex Barinka. I'm our tech M&A and US IPO reporter at Bloomberg. So after this event, if anyone's going public or selling themselves, I'm your girl to come talk to. I wanted to welcome everyone. Good evening. Thank you for being here. On behalf of all my colleagues at Bloomberg, I'm delighted to welcome you to the CIO event, Securing Silicon Valley. Special thanks to our sponsor for this event, NASDAQ, somebody who I know well as the IPO reporter. This is the first of this series in the area, and we're very excited to have you all. The second annual CIO Exchange returns to NASDAQ in New York on October 30th. I was there last year. It was fantastic. It's sure to be another highly informative day of programming geared toward tech leadership in the C-suite across industries and focusing on things like cloud infrastructure, delivering value for customers, and of course, security. Speakers for that event include the CIO of Symantec, among others. So if you're out on the easterly coast in October, then I hope you can join us there. I hope you've gotten to network with some of your contemporaries. There will be more time for that after this event. And also do feel free to grab those notebooks like a good reporter and take some notes here. We'll be drilling down into the evolving cybersecurity landscape from external threats to inside actors. And as you all know, securing technological aspects of your business has never been more important. CEOs' heads are on the table, and probably some of yours. To fight against the next wave of cybersecurity threats, companies must understand how to educate and collaborate with its workforce and use the most effective technology to identify potential attacks and potential malicious actors, and also to keep those folks from getting into your systems. We've got a great lineup of speakers. I'm very excited, from chief security officers to former FBI executives, to help us over the next hour dig into these things. As a reminder, everything said tonight is on the record, so please feel free to tweet the comments, observations, pictures, and photos using the hashtag CIO Exchange. And you can follow along on our Twitter feed at the handle @Bloomberg Live and also at NASDAQ. First, I'd like to bring a very special guest to the stage. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jack Castle, Vice President of New Listings and Capital Markets at NASDAQ. Jack.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alex, for the introduction. Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. As Alex alluded to, my name is Jack Castle. I'm Vice President of New Listings and Capital Markets, and it's my pleasure to kick off today's event on behalf of NASDAQ. In my role, I oversee all new listings or IPOs for the western region of the U.S., and in this role, I'm very fortunate, as well as our team, to work closely with some of the most innovative companies in the world, companies that are striving to tackle key challenges and issues that we all face on a daily basis. And one of those key concerns and issues today is certainly cybersecurity. In the past, this used to be relegated just to the IT department, coming from the sales and marketing and R&D. A lot of it was don't click here, don't visit these websites, don't lose your device. But any issues was kind of handled in the IT department. It was out of sight, out of mind. Nobody really knew how the sausage was made. But as we see and read every morning in the headlines, companies around the world face a relentless barrage of sophisticated cyber attacks and threats. And because of that, CEOs or kind of the broader C-suite and the board of directors are now taking a top-down approach in resolving this and putting in place strategies to resolve this and to defend against these threats. I know for us at NASDAQ, we have invested heavily in a significant amount in our information security, and we have one of the most robust and secure systems in the industry. As you can imagine, if something happens to the exchange, it affects the global markets. And so we have in place a very comprehensive cybersecurity program led by renowned industry experts and leveraging the newest and best of breed solutions and technologies, AI, ML, quantum computing, as well as some of the best third-party vendors who you'll hear from some today. On the listing side of thing, we are also proud to be the partner exchange for some of the best cybersecurity companies in the world, including Symantec, FireEye, and ClearPoint. And just this year, we also welcomed 2 new cybersecurity firms to the NASDAQ family with Carbon Black and Zscaler. Both companies priced at the high end of their IPO range and remained up throughout the day. And Zscaler actually is up a little over 80% year to date from their IPO price. So you're seeing a lot of receptivity in the market for the problem that these companies are now solving. I truly believe one of the constants in the valley here that we've adopted at NASDAQ is that drive for innovation, is discovering new ways of doing things. For us, since our inception in 1971, we've been at the forefront of financial technology when we developed and launched the first electronic stock exchange. And it is our mission to continue to innovate and work with partners like yourselves to work together to rewrite tomorrow. So we've got a great panel, a great list of speakers today. Thank you all for coming out, and I'm going to hand it back over to Alex.
Thanks. Thank you, Jack. Now I want to focus on insider threats, something that probably doesn't get as talked about, perhaps because it goes on behind closed doors of businesses like yours. Jack mentioned Carbon Black. I talked to CEO Patrick Morley on listing day, and he said the landscape's gotten so tough these days because the malware, the malicious technology is actually good software. If you have an insider who's opening the door to let that good software get behind your lines, that can become obviously a very serious problem. To talk about mitigating the risk of an employee accidentally or purposefully letting some bad actors in, I want to bring up 3 very informed panelists on this topic who will have some phenomenal insights. Here with me is Michelle Zatlin, COO and co-founder of Cloudflare, Jeff Belknap, Chief Security Officer at Slack, and Stephanie Douglas, Senior Managing Director for Guidepost Solutions and a former Executive Assistant Director with the FBI San Francisco office. Thank y'all for joining me. So when I think about insider threats and folks who are your own employees, that's a very kind of scary idea, right? To have somebody behind your lines, somebody who you hired, potentially being the entrance point for somebody to get in. So thinking through kind of the basics, when you think about at Cloudflare, how do you mitigate that risk? What are kind of the ABCs of mitigating against insider threats?
Okay, ABCs, let's see. Okay, so I would say we reiterate internally all the time. And so if you join Cloudflare, you go through new hire orientation, and we have a session of, this is what you do if you see something suspicious. We talk about it internally all the time, so it's self-reinforcing. So the first thing is to bring your workforce along with it, your team, and you start, again, we're a growing company, and we hire a lot of people. It starts day one, we're talking about it, and I'll tell you a funny story. Our sales team get insertion orders from customers, and they forwarded that. We have an internal security incident response, threat email alias. They forwarded insertion orders thinking, oh, this might be malicious. Recently our CEO emailed an engineer who he doesn't talk to very often because he had done really good work and he was kind of getting a special bonus, and he sent him a text saying, hey, do you have time for a call? The employee reported it through this internal, and so it's really built into our culture. So the first one is train your employees. The second thing is sharing the good and the bad. We talk a lot about both the successes of these things where people are forwarding it and then where we fall short because it rises all tides. And I think that what happens sometimes when something bad happens internally, you want to hide like a turtle, or you want to walk down the number of people who know about it. I think that trying to share that transparency internally and letting people learn from this so they can get better has been really, really valuable. And then the third thing, the C, is you got to assume that something bad is going to happen, and you have to limit the scope, surface area of how much bad they can do. And so this whole idea of zero trust networks, where it's It's you can get in, but they can't move laterally, or someone can't move laterally. So internally, whether it's locking down what people can do and making it much harder to move horizontally within the organization is a good practice.
And that zero trust idea, I mean, Slack has been kind of a forerunner in breaking down some of the barriers of how you work and making work very easy. But if you're having to institute things internally where you're stopping employees at every line of the way, that's a lot of friction. How do you kind of work through those ideas where it seems at the core Slack has revolutionized how folks communicate and by making things easier? How do you implement that in your security practices?
Yeah, I think the way you work is in parallel and sort of, we'll say tangentially related to the way you protect, right? So we take a very similar approach to Cloudflare, and we talk about problems aren't secrets, right? So we share problems, we bring sunlight where there needs to be more attention to things, and we encourage people to bring these things forward. On the other side of things, sort of on the back end, on the system side, where we're protecting our data and all of our customers' data, we look at zero trust or a trustless computing model where we say, okay, great, the barriers are no longer the network. The barriers are no longer internet and internal or intranet. They are the individual users, the individual laptops, devices, the workloads that are actually running in the environment. And we look at that trust boundary very differently than you would in a traditional organization or in a Fortune 500 legacy environment. And it really doesn't impact the way you work, it impacts the way you architect that system. And we're
Hopefully.
Well, ideally, yeah, in a perfect world.
So is that, I mean, what has been the number one thing that has caused you to rethink? Is it the proliferation of devices? Is it the fact that workloads can run in not just your on-premise servers? What is kind of the number one thing that has got you thinking along these lines?
I think the number one thing for us that's got us thinking along these lines is that the threat is no longer about protecting a perimeter, right? The threat is me as an individual existing in the world and having this relationship with a company that might have an interesting data set or something like that. And it's easy to target, especially somebody like me. Spoiler alert, I don't have access to any data. So, but there are individuals and it's easy to take a look at them. And there are, all bets are off in terms of people aren't just targeting you as an employee, they're targeting your personal life, your social media accounts, things like that. So if you keep that in mind, we can't really trust anything about you or who you say you are in terms of that boundary between trust and untrust and you representing yourself as an identity to a system. So if you assume you can't trust anything, and if you make these assumptions that I can't trust anything that's on my network, I can't trust things that people bring into my environment, it forces you to rethink how you make those decisions and then still actually get work done.
How many of you are rethinking how things work, how you make those decisions internally? One person?
Okay, how many of you are going to admit to it?
Two? Oh no. Oh no. Well, Stephanie, I mean, you might give some interesting insight. Break down a little bit what you do and how you actually help others kind of come to terms with some of these risks.
Sure. So we work with companies to basically mitigate risk in a number of different areas. We do it through investigations. We do it through executive education, and then also putting together compliance programs. Relative to insider threat, we are constantly working with companies to help them understand, first of all, what's their most important asset, what really matters to their company. We would all be bankrupting companies if we treated everything we had as the same and we put all of our security equally across everything we had. So we help companies identify the most important things and then building healthy security controls around those really, really important things, whether it's a piece of source code, particular research drawing. It could be, a number of different things. And here, where we work, you can just imagine all the different ideas that are being put into play every single day that have to be protected.
So given that context, what's the number one thing that your customers are asking you to help them with, or the number one problem you've seen manifest itself due to insider actors?
I think one of the number one problems I see is that people forget that threats are actually people, right? So your information isn't going to jump out of your system by itself, right? It's not going to leave your property without someone, and potentially one of your own insiders taking that or maliciously doing something to sabotage. I'm sure everybody's read the paper the last 2 days. Tesla has a great example of something like that where they have a concern about an insider. So getting companies to think about how do they build healthy processes across their enterprise dealing with people, helping them understand what their expectations are as employees, making sure that there are controls in place when they have access to critical information, respectfully and confidently building an investigative process that people look forward to using or at least trust when they use. I think you made some great examples in how people will do that. And then when it's time for people to go, reiterating what your expectations are. A lot of us sign, when we go into a workplace sometimes, we sign an NDA. What are the expectations that you have for your employees day one when they arrive at their workplace? And do they understand their responsibilities? So working through healthy business practices really is a big part of what we do.
And that gets to a little bit of what you said in your point A, bringing your workforce along with you. What are some things that you actually do in practice at Cloudflare that you've seen have kind of gotten everyone on the same page and potentially excited or at least looking forward to an investigative process if it's necessary?
So if I take a step back, if I go back, I think the security industry has done itself a disservice the last 10 years because it was always kind of the InfoSec team that was responsible for something or the security team, and everyone's like, oh, it's not my problem. The security team has it. And that's kind of how the industry really evolved. And what we found is that people are hungry and they want to be good actors and they want to be good stewards, and employees want to do the right thing. They just don't know what that means. And so where it starts is us explaining setting expectations. So if you join Cloudflare, literally day one, there's how do you have good password hygiene as you set up all your accounts. So on day one, you're setting up all your accounts. We want to iterate. We expect you to have good password hygiene on day one. And then, on day three, there's a security training where it's, here are the things to look for. Here's what you can do. This is why we have these different systems in place to help educate them. And then people feel like if you treat them like adults, they respond and they're like, great, this is really healthy. And so we talk a lot about it internally. We have different weekly, monthly meetings or weekly meetings or quarterly meetings. However you set it up. For us, it's weekly and quarterly. And it always becomes part of the narrative. And it's not just our chief security officer. It's great. It's great. You want them saying it, but it's our CEO, it's our CTO, it's me talking to the team about why this is important and showcasing, hey, here's an example of where the process worked really well, where we were able to catch something really quickly, and we celebrate that internally. Or where the process broke down and where it took us too long and it's escalated and whatnot, and this is what we're doing to fix it. Here are the places where the process broke down. And so we bring that into these weekly meetings or quarterly kickoffs in the right way, just to reiterate it, because you can't just do it on day one and then forget about it, because people are busy. So it's this constant reiteration so that we raise all tides is how we think about it.
And that idea of bringing up issues, that seems like a scary thing. It's admitting your faults to basically all the folks who are supposed to be trusting you to, spearhead the security efforts. That does seem like a kind of new thing. I started covering enterprise tech in 2012, and back then it was a lot of talk of, can we get the whole industry together and share everything? And a lot of the big legacy companies said, no, no, no. It seems like it's a changing mindset. How have you seen that evolve in the last decade or so? I think
Externally, the culture between companies has really not evolved. The things that still do happens practitioner to practitioner. So I'll talk to my peers, some of which I see here tonight, and we'll frequently talk through these kind of issues. We'll talk about what are we worried about, how are we solving these problems, how are we evolving as leaders. But I think the thing that really matters is how do you change your internal culture, right? So you as an organization have to be comfortable having these discussions before you can even start to approach having them with other people. And I think the really pivotal thing that's changed, at least for us here and at my last place, was thinking about security as not like the thing we need to do to have more security is more enforcement, more in people's face, more friction. And instead, we think about security is not the police. Security is the paramedics. We're here to kind of assess the situation, understand what's happened, help you up, help you along your way. And the really important thing is along with that mindset is understanding that you're there to help that person. You're not there to accuse them or understand if they're the criminal that's involved, although to some extent that might be your job later, but that's not what's helpful in the initial incident. And I think that really helps change people's perspectives when they look at the security team. They say, oh, they really are here to help me. I'm going to do better as well. And I'm not afraid to bring things to that team.
And that mindset of being the paramedic and not the police, I understand when things blow up, approaching them as we're here to help you. Are there other ways that you kind of use that mindset in your day-to-day, not the enforcer, but the support team perhaps?
I think, it sort of permeates everything that we do, right? Everybody's here to help. Everybody really wants to do the right thing. Nobody really enjoys an investigation other than the investigators. I mean, sometimes we're sort of there for that. Overall, what we try to do is push security, or at least detection, to the very edge. And an example of that at Slack is we use something called SecurityBot. When SecurityBot sees something that might be going wrong, it'll send a message to the person that we think is involved and say, hey, this thing happened and it might be bad. Was it you? Is this something we should investigate? Now, that's not the beginning and end of whether we investigate, but it brings you into that and lets you know whether something you were doing is something that would be bad, that is not ideal, that some behavior you're doing needs to be modified. And then it also helps us as investigators gather information about that activity, right? And that's much different than maybe 10 or 15 years ago, where you'd immediately go, okay, got an alert, I need to go investigate it. Maybe I need to lock this person out of the building and seize their hard drives and image them. And then you'd turn out that they went to a malicious ad or something inadvertently. And those two experiences are vastly different, where you feel like the security team is engaged and vested in your success versus the security team is this evil thing that lurks in the background. I think everybody has an idea of which one they'd prefer to work with.
I know which camp I would rather be in. So Stephanie, when you think through this idea of paramedic and not the police, how have you seen successful companies use that mindset to resolve some of the investigations that your company helps them with?
Sure. So successful companies care about their people. Their people are their most important asset, right? So we see this come into play, especially when we have employees who are in crisis. And when I say crisis, it could be a family crisis, it could be a financial crisis, it could be I hate my boss crisis, okay? So I'm sure everybody here in this room can think of an example in your workplace where you've seen this play out. But there are technical tools, and we've talked a little bit about them, that might identify anomalies undertaken by that person that are very unusual to that person. Plus, there are behavior issues that might come up that maybe management or a peer may see that they have concerns about an employee. Having a system and a process where people can report those concerns and that they can be proactively addressed, and it may not be a role for security, right? It may be a role for EAP or HR. But you have to have a multi-functioning team to really approach issues with employees, whether it's an insider threat and it ends up being a full-blown security investigation, or it's an employee in crisis who may be about to do something foolish and that could impact the company. Having a multi-function team that's there to support the employee, get in front of them becoming a threat, I think really builds trust and confidence in your employees to utilize the process.
I think that's really interesting because there's more and more talk these days about what happens at home doesn't necessarily stay at home in the context of your employees being the best version of themselves when they're at work. And to hear this come up in a security context is super interesting. What are are there examples that you can share in terms of folks who have gone off the rails? We don't need to name names, but I'm just curious about, as much as a reporter loves to name names, I'm curious about kind of the context of some of those situations and how some of the folks in the audience might see something like that in their own organization.
Sure. So, there's plenty of examples. So if we think about an employee who may be in crisis with family stuff, hates their job, having possibly having a conflict with the manager, right? And then that employee can then think of all kinds of options that are available to him. Maybe some of it is actually taking sensitive IP, going to a competitor, seeking out a different job, right? But having some kind of engagement, if somebody brings forward a concern for that person, and if there's an ability to get in front of it and have a conversation and express concern by the company, provide assistance in the form of, even if it's peer support or a frank conversation with the manager that cares, or EAP assistance, I tell you goes a long way with building a loyal workforce. And that reduces your chance for insider threats.
And in a place like Silicon Valley, where it seems like it's almost rewarded if you spend a year at one shop and move on to another, that seems to be something that's very important. And that covers well the disgruntled employee scenario. We also kind of touched on briefly the accidental clicking of malware. There is another party there. It's not necessarily just the employee that's going to benefit. Who are you seeing are the folks that you're most worried about who would benefit from an insider doing something malicious? Is it foreign government? Is it competitors? Who is most on the mind and being the most sophisticated these days in either one of those kind of venues to get at an employee?
I mean, as an executive running our company, we think about all those things. And what's really hard, and as people who work in security, it's hard to say that the threat is always zero, right? You're always trying to minimize the chances of something, and if something does go wrong, how do you minimize the damage? And so we always try and put systems in place to help minimize the potential damage, but we do worry. We employ a lot of foreign nationals at Cloudflare as engineers who have lots of access to lots of different sorts of things. So we do, especially early on, we thought about, what if a foreign government put this person at Cloudflare? What will we change? And then we started to do that and close the risk so that we can still employ them and it not be an impact to our business. And so we use these sorts of exercises, thought exercises of, we called them meteors. That's what we call them internally. Our executive team, we talk about the meteors that could impact our business. And one of them is an insider or some sort of breach. And we talked about how can we reduce the surface area. And we start to take steps to that. So definitely foreign nationals. For us, it's less about competitors, but it's definitely foreign nationals. And the other one are just sophisticated hackers who want to claim victory. They want to wear a badge of honor. They want to say, wow, look who. I mean, hacking to Slack, hacking to Cloudflare, hacking to Bloomberg. Those are like badges for the hackers. That almost gives them stripes. And so we think about those too.
What about you, Jeff?
Honestly, I think very little about who benefits, right? At the end of the day, we look at what the activity is, and for us, the malicious activity looks the same whether your device has been compromised or your account has been compromised, or whether that individual's integrity has been compromised. The actions are all the same, right? So we think about the definition of an insider as someone who's motivated to make a decision that's against the best interest of the organization. It doesn't matter why they're motivated, right? It's more about we want to detect that, we want to be responsive to that, and to the extent possible, we want to prevent that, right? Because that's the cheapest, most effective way to deal with that. And when you're looking at a general rule of thumb of you have, for every 1,000 employees, you have roughly maybe one insider that's actively malicious, you have to be focused on what are the easy, low-friction ways to address that. And then how do you make sure you're onboarding employees, especially at a company that's growing at the rate that Slack is, that are becoming and embracing part of the culture. And that really, to your point, makes a huge difference about whether there's going to be a problem, whether anybody's going to flag that there might be an issue, and help address that. And who benefits from that is sort of an after-the-fact discussion.
I'm curious, you did bring up that the external communication between executives at different companies hasn't really happened, but you have had some conversations with some of your peers. What's the number one thing that you want to know how folks at other organizations in your role deal with this problem? What are you curious about how other people cope with the idea of an insider threat?
I think I'm really lucky in that in this job and in a previous job, we had a pretty advanced, we'll say, program for how we thought about insider. I think what I see, I run a little Slack team for CISOs. Got about 80 people in there from Fortune 500 and mid-range growth companies. And the thing that I see most of us asking each other is like, is this a thing? Do you have a program? Are you investing resources? What does that investment look like? How do I balance that investment across all the other investments that I have to make in security? And the thing we spend the most time about is just understanding like what's the right balance. A CISO's job really at the end of the day is I have all these risks and I have all these business objectives. How do I balance these things without affecting one or the other or knowing what the impact is between those? And the discussion really just comes down to, after you get past imposter syndrome, making sure that you're giving the right investment to those.
So I want to take advantage of the fact that I do have such a wonderful panel here and look kind of outside the insider threat space. I am curious, what's the top thing that you're thinking about in the context of your clients these days when it comes to security outside of insider threats? What's bubbled up to the surface these days?
It's kind of related to insider threats, but workplace violence is obviously a huge concern for employers. It's very closely aligned to insider threat, and if you want to talk to me offline, I'll give you my whole spiel on that. But it's just dealing with companies with a very, very open culture and really trying to be collaborative, be good communicators with employees, and then how do they approach a very sensitive topic like workplace violence without scaring people and putting effective processes in place where people feel safe in their workplaces.
It gets back to the culture kind of tenet of keeping insider threats from happening, it seems. What about you, Michelle?
So what we hear a lot from our customers is that before, if you had an internet property, 5 years ago, the answer would have been like a DDoS attack, and those have gone away. Like those have been solved. And if you're solving a problem with it, you should definitely call me. I can solve it for you. And lots of people can solve it. That problem has been solved for lots of contextual reasons in the market. But what's still really hard for companies is layer 7 attacks. So somebody trying to like target your login page, and that's really hard because the volume is not the same. But they're more fine, but the problematic to defend against. And so that's something that we've seen a lot on behalf of our customers hearing. And companies are all worried about it. And they're like, how do I stop this? How do I protect from this? And so it's these layer 7 attacks at the HTTP level that's tricky for companies right now. And again, we're helping to solve those on behalf of our customers.
How would you describe the pace of change in terms of what the new concern du jour is?
I mean, so it's hard to, so on one side, things are always changing. So I don't want to like downplay this. Things are always changing. But, if you ask me, am I more optimistic today than 5 years ago? If I'm a company running a company, am I more optimistic today about the future of being protected online or not optimistic? I'm way more optimistic. I think that the solutions available today for companies are much better than they were 5 or 10 years ago. Much better. So that's not to downplay that you have to take it seriously. There's lots of bad things going on. You just got to open the paper. But I think that the world is going to get a lot better 5 years from now, and that companies, if they're making the right choices, can defend themselves. I think the tools are much better today than before. And so the threat landscape is always changing. But what I think is interesting is the market solutions are so good that they're changing just as fast. And again, especially in my business, we work at the internet level. We help make things faster, safer, more reliable. And what's so interesting is for the first time, we have over 8 million internet properties that use Cloudflare. We crowdsource all the threat data across all 8 million internet properties. So for the first time, we have more data points than the bad actors. We have more resources than the bad actors. That is it's flipped. The asymmetric tree is flipped, which makes it very effective. So as soon as they switch, our system just learns really quickly using some AI and machine learning because we have such a big data set. And so the problem goes away really quickly. And so that's why I'm optimistic for the future. And things are switching, but that's why you have great people in the industry paying attention. And I think why we talk about it, whether it's behind closed doors or more, what I love is that the media is covering these things more. And what I want it to be less fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I think we got to get way of, oh my God, this bad thing is happening. We got to start having much more business coverage. It becomes, if you want to be a business leader, you just need to understand the ABCs of security. And we just need to be telling more stories, both good and bad, because it's not going away, but things are going to get better if we rise all tides.
As a business reporter, I can tell you the proliferation of security companies that have gotten to the IPO threshold, which is, infers a level of revenue and maturity, has definitely ballooned.
There are too many cybersecurity companies.
There are a lot of them, and my fear is always that they sell themselves, and I'm not the first to break the news. Jeff, I want to end with you.
Come find Alex.
I know, come find me. Speaking of insider actors, so number one thing on your mind outside of insider actors that you're thinking about at the present?
I think more broadly, I'm thinking about exactly what we just talked about, which is how do we talk more about security and security being part of operating the business? I think if you roll the clock back to sort of pre-Enron times, you saw CFOs were a part of the boardroom, and sort of people kind of sort of understood what the role was. And then post-Enron, people really said, wow, that these CFOs have a lot of power. We should standardize how this works. We should make them have some skin in the game, and there should be some rules. I think the sort of self-servingly, the CISO role really needs to become more standardized and needs to be a part of that discussion about how you operate the business, so that right now, CISOs are all over the map. You really can't understand. If I meet a CISO in another organization, it's hard to imagine what might be within their scope of responsibility and what their relationship with the board or the executive team looks like. I'm very, very privileged in that I have access to the board and part of the executive team. Not everybody is. And there's no one way to understand what that should look like. I think now is the time to start thinking about what that should be. And making it a bigger part of public companies and private companies. What
is the ideal CISO kind of framework in your mind?
I walked into that one.
I really did. Got to hit you hard with the good follow-up.
I think I'll just say what works really well for me is having regular relationship with the board, having that discussion. And then focusing that role on somebody that's responsible both from an engineering and a business perspective to own the risk and own the execution of balancing that risk and balancing the business priorities. And it's not necessarily the person who's the most technical person in the organization, but it should be somebody that understands how a business operates and understands the levers that drive a business versus just understands how technology operates. I think we're really coming to a head there in terms of understanding that, but I think the rest of it in terms of, look, there's going to be regulation. New York DFA now says you've got to be part of reporting. You've got to make a report to the board. There's got to be that relationship. I think we'll see more of that probably at the federal level for public and private companies, and I think that will help sort of solidify. Yeah, there we go. That's a word. Solidify and sort of concretely define what that role should be.
Well, on that note, I want to thank our wonderful panelists, Michelle, Jeff, and Stephanie. Thank you for joining us. Y'all are free to go, and do feel free to connect with these folks after the fact. I am selfishly happy that Jeff brought that up because it touches on a topic that I'm excited to get into with my next guest. But first, when I think about what's leading the security agenda, I don't think it's any surprise that my mind has gone quickly to some of the most far-reaching data privacy regulation this world has ever seen. Yes, folks, that is GDPR. We will touch on that briefly. To many folks outside this room, the aim of GDPR seems simple: protect people from losing control of their own information. But for the people in this room, how many of you all have had a headache or two from GDPR? Again, only, more hands. More concerns about GDPR than concerns in general about insider threats, it seems. So next, I'm joined by Adobe's Chief Security Officer, Brad Arkin. We'll talk about how GDPR has changed his day-to-day and touch on some of the other key topics discussed these days in the C-suite. Please give a warm welcome to Brad. And Thank you for joining us. And what Jeff was talking about was something that we had touched on briefly. I was lucky enough to chat with you beforehand. The role of a chief security officer. At Adobe, where do you kind of fit within the organization? We'll start there and then we'll jump into GDPR.
So my boss is our chief technical officer. His boss is the CEO. And we've thought a lot about what is the right reporting structure. And I think at some companies, maybe reporting to the general counsel, chief risk officer. For me, I don't necessarily think the security leader has to report to CEO directly, but definitely at that second layer. I think if you're further down, that's a recipe for bad outcomes. Another thing that I've come to believe is that if you have a CIO under CFO, that's not a good recipe. And particularly if you have a CISO under CIO under CFO, that's a bad recipe. But depending on the organization, chief risk officer, general counsel, CTO, maybe some other group, COO, I think these are all viable reporting structures.
A lot of C alphabet soup there. When I talked to you beforehand, I like to lean on folks like you all. Y'all are the smartest folks in the room. The agenda here today was to talk about what's leading the cybersecurity agenda, and the first thing that came out of Brad's mouth was GDPR. So when we think about how that's impacted your day-to-day, what's the answer there? What's been the biggest change?
Yeah, and I
in the
can
last 12
give a little
months?
context because at Adobe we have a chief privacy officer and she works for our general counsel. And so the CPO is responsible for figuring out what do the laws on the books actually mean in the context of Adobe's business. And so they do that translation and then they work with different parts of the business to make that happen. And then I am one of the many stakeholders that receives guidance from the CPO about how it's going to change my day-to-day. And so incident response and monitoring is one of the big areas. And so looking at what are our new obligations under GDPR that are different than what we had beforehand. And so we need to notify, if we're the data processor and our customer is the data controller, then if something happens, we need to notify them with a certain time period so they can then make a decision about notification to their regulatory body within 72 hours potentially. And so things like that inform what our playbooks look like and what the timeframes are we have to respond.
And it's a very serious thing. What is it? 4% of worldwide revenue, annual sales could potentially be the size of a fine in some big bad run-ins with the new regs. And I wanted to pull this quote from Andrea Jelinek. She's the Austrian in charge of policing GDPR. She said, if there are reasons to warn, we will warn. If there are reasons to reprimand, we will do that. And if we have reasons to fine, we are going to fine. So when you're thinking about how you cope from a security standpoint with the interpretation being the key word, the interpretation of the regulations, so with something that's not necessarily set in stone, how are you kind of dealing with it from a security lens at Adobe?
Yeah, and this is something, we started working on GDPR 2 years ago, and we got clarification guidance as late as April this year.
Clarification guidance?
Yeah.
Like,
so,
what does that even mean?
The regulatory bodies were giving us, extensive written documentation with 3 weeks to go, and we've been working on it for 2 years. And so a lot of the questions that we had as the technical group working with the legal team is, what does this mean? How do we apply this? Like you say, rights and freedoms, what does that mean in our world? And in a lot of cases, we just said, look, if we do right by the customer, if we try to make good decisions that we can justify later, even though it's completely ambiguous in terms of what the laws say, that feels like a good start, as long as we, with a straight face, feel really good about our practices. And so we had to fill in a lot of the gaps early on because we didn't have answers to the questions that we had internally. And so we just said, well, this sounds good, this feels good to me. And so the big thing for us is figuring out how can we identify when something bad has happened and understand that it might have regulatory implications and then react to that in a certain time frame. And so really taking what used to be our playbook and compressing that down into a much shorter time frame. So that was one of the big things that we changed.
And compressing that playbook, is that an easy thing?
No,
what
not at all.
what are some things that you can suggest to the group that have been successful, just in terms of how you think about doing everything you used to do in a much shorter time period?
So one thing that used to happen is that if we had an incident with certain characteristics that involved data we were managing on behalf of enterprise customers. So they are the data controller, their customers are the data subjects. We are the data processor who is providing services to the data controller. If something goes bump in the night and we need to investigate that, the details of how we respond may depend on each customer contract. And so if you have 1,000 different enterprise customers, in the old days, we might have lawyers looking paragraph by paragraph in the contracts and looking at, a scanned version of some wedding signature PDF to say, like, what do we actually agree to 8 years ago when we signed this? And usually these contracts might have been signed with a company we then acquired. And so it's like really hard to get to the bottom of what the deal actually is. And so pulling out what are the security relevant terms, having those quickly available so we can just search a database, and something that might have taken days before we can do in seconds. So that's one example of how we can compress that, but it's really understanding obligations and then having the internal contacts. And so if we need to work with customer care, legal, PR, and some other group, it helps to know them in advance, to know who to call. What if that person's on vacation? What if we don't, their cell phone broke or something, it's the weekend? Having on-call lists, like all of these things you can work in advance, and it's so much easier to do it in advance than it is in the middle of a crisis.
Are you working with folks like the CMO? Are you working with folks like customer care? Who are the new players within the organization that you're working with more these days to make sure you're complying with the new regs?
Yeah, and a lot of this stuff is not specific to regulations, it's just like good practice. So for a long time now, we've had good relationships with the marketing team. So I have, in addition to my technical responsibilities, I have a security marketing team that's part of my organization. We have corporate communications that's dedicated to security topic. And so that CMO org we work with very closely.
Why is that important?
Well, if something bad happens, the difference in how we message and communicate that to the audiences that need to hear about it can make or break how it's perceived. And so we could have a really great response, and if we butcher the communication plan, it won't matter. And so having a great way to carry the message and having partners on the communication team who can speak our language and they understand the right questions to ask. And then we do a lot of work where we have existing relationships with security reporters, people in the trade industry. And so we can work with these groups in order to make sure that we know the questions they'll be asked, we know the right way to answer it in a way that's like technical and complete and accurate, and then we can get that message out. And then the goal is, if anything ever happens, we can just talk to it, get it over with, take our lumps if appropriate, and then we move on, and that's it. And so having a good communication plan and the resources allocated to that task is a real part of success there.
You mentioned the marketing side of the house. Are there other kind of houses that you end up
so legal, I'm an honorary lawyer. I get invited to their offsites. So we spend a lot of time with legal. Customer care, the engineering teams. I probably spend the most time with engineering. And my responsibility is not just with doing back office IT security, but the products we sell to customers. And so working with the engineers to make sure that we're thinking about security, that's probably the biggest role. The CIO is a peer to me. We both work for the CTO, so we work very closely together. And it's really, I can't think of a part of the company I don't work with regularly. Like sales, we interact with sales all the time to support their conversations with the customers. So it's really every corner of the company these days.
I'm curious from that venue, from the sales team, what are customers asking about most these days in terms of a security context?
And because I own vendor risk management, so I inflict security questionnaires on my vendors, and then I also have the team that responds to security questionnaires that get inflicted on us by our buyers. And so some customers want to have a conversation, they want to see our SOC 2 report, and they're happy. Some people send us a spreadsheet with 1,200 rows, and we have to answer every single one. And sometimes, sometimes we have 3-4 hour meetings in a row, and followed up by a 5-day on-site audit. And so it really can span the gamut of how big is the company that's buying from us, how mature is their vendor risk management program, and how heavy is their regulatory burden, and then they channel that through to us as the vendor. And so the newer questions are, how are we going to enable their compliance with GDPR? And usually there's more than just GDPR, it's other regulations. And then every geography has its own questions. And so talking through how do we do things, how are we going to keep them safe, how are we going to live up to the standards that they care about when it comes to security, all of that comes into play.
And vendor risk management, the issues that pop up in the cybersecurity world, they, as we talked about, and we will continue talking about, have increased. How has that changed? How has the vendor risk management process changed for you?
Well, so for me, we actually, because of GDPR, we went and refreshed the kinds of questions we were asking our sellers who were selling to us. And so there's just a lot of things that contractually we have to make sure we get explicitly clarified, whereas before it was kind of gray area. So that's one thing we did. Another thing that we've worked on is making sure that we understand from a compliance perspective, like what is their compliance story? And compliant, just because you're compliant doesn't mean you're secure, but if someone is not compliant, that can complicate the story. If something goes wrong and you're trying to show to people that we did our due diligence, we kicked the tires, and they say they're not even compliant, how can you say that? And so compliance is something we pay more attention to these days.
Is there something that you've done in terms of GDPR or a decision that was made that you look back on now and you're just like, God, I'm so glad I did that?
Let me think about this. I think so. Probably 6 or 7 years ago, we started to build bridges with our customer care team, and that was a good idea back then. We had certain reasons for that, but these days it's so much more valuable because of the GDPR conversations. And so usually we get the security questions from our customers during pre-sales as part of the due diligence the customer prospective buyer is doing before they actually contract. And with GDPR, we had pretty much every customer under the sun was going through their top 10,000 vendors and saying, we're going to talk to every single one and ask these 6 GDPR questions. And so a lot of those were coming in through customer care and not through the sales team. And so because customer care knew us, we could work together to make sure they got the right answers, and that went really smoothly. And if it was hitting every little corner of customer care and they didn't know how to reach us, that would have been tough. So I think that's something that really paid off after the fact.
And I think a little bit of context around where Adobe sells into is important, because it's not just individuals, it's not just enterprise.
That's right,
So
yeah.
you get a mix of both.
When people hear Adobe, some people think PDF,
Right.
some people think Flash Player, some people think Steve Jobs. Like there's a lot of things that spring to your mind when you hear Adobe. And we've got 2 major chunks to our business. We have the B2C business where we sell things like Photoshop and Acrobat to individual buyers, and that's through our Creative Cloud business, our Document Cloud business. And then we have an enterprise version of that. So big companies will buy Creative Cloud from us, and we call that Creative Cloud Enterprise. Same thing for Doc Cloud. And then we have our digital experience business, and that is almost entirely enterprise and large enterprise customers. And so that's pretty much all B2B. And so the ways that we interact with our customers, if they're individuals, if they're large enterprise, they're going to have very different questions, and the way we communicate to them is going to be very different.
So I think we've established GDPR has been a little bit of a headache. Are there other either headaches or things that you like addressing? What are your top 2 things outside of GDPR that you're discussing
so
internally?
A few years ago, the big push for us was making sure that the joke is you have to be this tall to ride, and so we wanted every team in the company to reach a minimum bar of sufficient security quality. And what we've done since then is we've started to identify these pockets of excellence on different topics. And so now we're saying, okay, everyone is good enough. Now let's make everyone as good as we can be. And so usually that involves picking a winner of how do you solve a particular problem. And Adobe's a big place. We have 10,000 plus code writers. And so we have so many different ways that we've solved the same problem over and over again. And so we may take, secret storage or certificate management or secure remote access to production servers. And there might be 10, 12, 15 different ways we've solved that problem across all the hundreds of different engineering teams we have. And so we've gone through over the past year and a half of picking the best of breed solution to each of these major topics. And we call this now our operational security stack. And so now we're going through and saying we want everybody to deprecate their usage of the non-winning solutions and start to migrate to the winning solution. And that way, what we're doing, which is already the best, we can then make it better and better, as opposed to having a bunch of things that are sort of floating around good enough. And so whenever you go to an engineer and you say, we're going to do this program, and they get really excited because they know in their heart their solution is the best, and this is their chance to be acknowledged as smarter than everyone else. And so people are totally into it. And then when we say, hey, guess what, we're actually picking this one and it's not yours, and then 9 out of 10 people in the room are like wailing and say, maybe I'm going to take my ball and go home, and they don't want to play anymore. We're like, no, we're going to follow through with this. So we spent the first 18 months sort of shouting, and now we've got our security stack defined, and we're going through the process of deprecating and migrating. And so it's a big effort, but it's fun because we're now starting to get to the point where there is one way that we do AWS account management across the company. There's one way that we do secrets management, and then we can really make that as awesome as we can make it, and reach the benefits of that and know that those improvements are going to touch everything company-wide.
Are there, and you touched on this a little bit, in
Yeah.
terms of the getting your workforce along with you for the ride and how important that is. How did you implement that with getting this kind of very set standards?
And for Adobe, we have the curse and the benefit that if anything goes wrong, it's big news. And so we've had a lot of news coverage about security in the past, and if we ship a security update for FlashPlayer, it gets lots of news coverage. And so, you know, I've been in the security industry 20 plus years, and 15 years ago, you'd have to convince an engineering team, this is important, you need to pay attention. We never have that conversation at Adobe because people get it, like from the very beginning. So we have that as a benefit. So really then it just comes down to the hard debates around resource allocation and relative prioritization, because you can do something awesome for a customer that they're gonna appreciate right away, and it might improve revenue by 20%. Or we're gonna do this thing no one will ever notice because it's just improving stuff in the back end. But if we don't do it, there's some chance something bad might happen. And so that's like, how do you balance those things? And so basically taking the security list and then the customer feature list, and we zipper that together and try to make good choices. So that's where we spend all our time really hashing that through.
Stepping back to a more philosophical follow-up to Jeff's point, do you think that the CSO role should be standardized in the same vein as a CFO is?
It is nowhere near standardized today. And so, you know, my job title is Chief Security Officer. Adobe has never had a C-level security leader before this role was created that I'm in today. And we spent a lot of time thinking through, because in the industry you have CISO, you have CSO, sometimes you have Chief Trust Officer. And a lot of times we think CISO tends to imply back office IT security, and my role spans that plus all the things we do for customers. So we call it a CSO. But a lot of CSOs actually focus on physical security. And so I get a lot of these active shooter, you know, spam emails and things like that, like detection systems and stuff.
The pitches that fill my inbox
Exactly,
are irrelevant.
exactly. And so, so Adobe has a physical security guy. He's part of my extended team, and that's his job. It's not my job. And so, so the thing is, though, is that in a lot of companies, they don't really have this concept of product security. And so really CISO is all they need. And so I think we will see standardization over time, but each industry and each company has its own heritage of how they got there. So I don't see this happening like in the next 3 years. I think this is a longer 10, 20-year journey before, you know, because today CFO, general counsel, like those are really clear job descriptions. And for the security leader today, it's a hodgepodge, depending on which company you look at. And so a lot of companies, I think, are moving more towards this fully consolidated, like one leader that owns anything technical security, because bad guys don't care about org charts. But a lot of companies are still on their journey in that direction.
So there's a lot of folks with those titles in the room. If you could have the pick of the litter and ask them any questions you want, what are the top 2 questions, let's say?
Yeah, so my big thing, which I never get tired talking about, and cocktail hour later, you can come tell me your answer. It's focusing on basically the governance frameworks. And so I report to CTO and he reports to CEO. I read out to the CEO and his direct reports once a month. I meet with the board every quarter. It's the audit committee and occasionally the full board. This is the things we talk about. My audit committee is full of CEOs and CFOs, and so they're not security technical experts. And so the conversations we have are pretty broad compared to if I'm talking to someone on my team. And how does that compare to what you guys are doing? What do you do in your environment? What good ideas can I steal shamelessly and just adopt in my environment? Because I feel like as an industry, we're all kind of flailing around, trying to figure out that governance framework together. And so like if you agree to disagree with the senior leader in the company, what happens? And then we see these things in the news. So like what if legal says we're not going to notify about some issue, and then maybe that's the wrong call? So like what happens? How do you deal with that? So these things to me are really interesting.
So do ask him or do give your answer. Is there something that you've heard from someone else that you thought was really interesting or that you've implemented internally?
So there's things that I hear are interesting, and then we debate it and talk about, like, is this the time to do it? So I was talking to somebody who's the chair of an audit committee for a public company, and this person viewed cybersecurity as like the first new thing to happen in corporate governance in 50 years. And so his take on it was the security leader should be a direct report to the board, probably the audit committee, and the audit committee should review their comp and their bonus and things like that. Same as the chief internal auditor, or head of internal audit, chief audit executive. And this is a really new thing to me. Like I haven't heard a lot of companies doing this, but this guy had conviction. He's got a sterling resume, so he knows what he's talking about. And so we went back and talked about that at Adobe, and we haven't made any changes on that front. But things like that to me are really interesting about, and part of it is at Adobe, we can't imagine a scenario where I might need that reporting structure, because if I want to tell them something, I just tell them.
Sure.
You know, I'm not worried about my boss stamping on my bonus or anything. So, so there's not a problem we need to fix there, but that's one example.
Well, great. Brad, thank you for joining us. Unfortunately, we are all out of time up here, but lucky for you all, you can take these discussions offline because that concludes our program.
Okay.
I hope you're walking away tonight having tucked away a tip or two about how you protect your businesses. I want to be sure again to thank our wonderful sponsor, NASDAQ, and please mark your calendars for that October 30th date in New York. As I mentioned, the second annual CIO Exchange returns to NASDAQ for another highly informative day of programming geared toward the most vital aspects of your business. We hope you'll join us. Also, continue those conversations online on Twitter, hashtag CIO Exchange, or the Bloomberg Live or NASDAQ handles. More conversation will be going on there. And do head out and grab some drinks and snacks, and we will see you all shortly. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. That was fun.